the United States. And we find that starting out undecided is actually a choice that we see many people make in our debates, where there are questions with a lot of nuance like we have today, where people come really to listen to both sides before making up their minds and remain truly open to debate, which is our name. So you don't have to do that. If your conviction is there and solid, go for it. But if you're undecided and thinking you want to listen, go for that as well. So we'll have another poll at the end of the debate to see which side has been the most persuasive in your view. And we're going to share the results of that poll tomorrow on the app. So make sure, again, to register to vote before and after, to poll before and after you've heard the arguments. So we're going to make those arguments and get them started in just a moment. But before we do, I want to bring to the stage Javier Elaje, who is the Chief Legal and Policy Officer for Human Rights Foundation. Please welcome to the stage. We can come around front here. I just wanted to chat fundamentally to say how pleased we are to have been invited back. Last year was an experiment. You all took a risk, and I think that it worked, and we're delighted to be back again, particularly because we really feel our values are so aligned with yours, particularly when it comes to the issue of free speech. And that's where ideas get hashed out, and that's our commitment, and we know that that's only a part of your commitment. So thank you so much for having us. And we're curious just to understand why you think having debate brought to the program is a good idea.
Thank you, John. This is hugely important for us. As you know, the main format of the Oslo Freedom Forum are TED Talk style presentations, the ones that you saw in the morning. And over the years, we've been implementing panel conversations. Panel conversations do allow from some opposition of views, but we think that the purposeful confrontation of ideas, and in this case, in a debate format, was perfect to try to achieve what we want, which is to be persuasive. Ultimately, we don't want people to feel that we're selling them something and that there is no counter argument. And this gives us the perfect format for us. From a free speech perspective, you know, Oliver Wendell Holmes, in his Schenck dissent opinion, he said, the best test of truth, ultimately, is the power of ideas to impose themselves in the marketplace of ideas. And this allows us to hear different ideas over the same topic. Also, it's a tradition that I think in Western knowledge has been lost over time. You know, late scholastics, St. Augustine, St. Thomas, they used to write in a way where they said, on purpose, they said, this is a proposition, here is the counter argument, and here's my take based on that. And I think this format that you guys created through your amazing organization, Open to Debate, I'm a big fan. I've looked it up. You've had so many incredible debates over the years. So for us, it's an honor, really, and we're so happy that we get to have this small space for a purposeful and clear debate on difficult topics. People might assume that we have one or the other position on this question, for example, from a policy perspective, but that's why we want to test them, and we want to actually give attendees the opportunity to make a choice based on the strength of the arguments of the panelists.
We are honored to be back. Thank you so much.
Thank you, John. Appreciate it. Thank you. Hope you enjoy it.
Thank you. I want to thank you for what you just did in terms of applauding, because we are taping the debate, and we release this through across the United States through public radio and across the world through our YouTube release, and we also have a Substack page, and so we exist as audio and video. So this debate is actually going to reach an audience potentially of millions. And just for the sake of atmospherics and for the audience that hears this to know that you are all actually here, I would love it if at various points that I hope will be obvious that you'll applaud, spontaneously, of course. For example, when I invite the debaters to the stage, that would be an example. So I think I'm going to do that right now. Let me just, yeah. Let's invite our debaters to the stage, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome Isaac Stonefish and Joanna Chu. So we have two debaters today to argue this motion. Is it ethical to cooperate with Chinese state institutions to secure incremental change? A note on some definitions. When we refer to Chinese state institutions, we are applying a broad brush. So we are including the realms of education and investment and joint research and trade and the arts, essentially any aspect of life controlled or influenced by the Chinese Communist Party, which I think both of our debaters agree is pretty much or almost everything. So we've brought our debaters to the stage, but let's learn a little bit more about them. First, I want to welcome again, taking the position yes, arguing that cooperation is ethical. I want to again welcome Joanna Chu. And Joanna, you're an expert on China and currently managing partner at Nora Global Managers, which was founded by journalists and researchers to help organizations navigate Asia's geopolitics and culture. In fact, you are a former investigative journalist yourself. You lived in China, you reported on China, you wrote about China, including in your book, China Unbound. Joanna, thanks so much for joining us. And taking the no position, I want to welcome Isaac Stonefish. Isaac, you've debated with us before, so I'm going to say welcome back. You're the CEO and founder of Strategy Risks, which advises companies on corporate exposure to China and helps them reduce risk. You're also the author of a book called America Second, and that's a book about Beijing's influence on the United States. Welcome to the program again. And just very briefly, on a personal note, I know that both of you have lived in China, and I just very briefly want to get a sense of what that experience was like for you. Joanna, first.
Yeah, so I was born in Hong Kong, and my parents left Hong Kong actually because of Tiananmen. But instead of enjoying my life in Canada and turning away, I just really wanted to become a journalist in China and build bridges. So I spent all my career focused on China, first in Hong Kong for newspapers and outlets there, and then in Beijing and reporting across the country.
Which so qualifies you for this debate. Thanks so much for joining us. What about for you, Isaac, your experience living in China?
I lived in Beijing for about 6 years. A wonderful country, shame about the party.
Also qualified to take part in this debate. So let's get down. We go in 3 rounds, and in our first round, I'll explain the rounds as we go through them, but in our first round, the debaters have the floor individually with no interruptions from anybody else. We're going to go first with Joanna, who is arguing that it is ethical to cooperate with Chinese state institutions to secure incremental change. You have 4.5 minutes, and the space is yours.
Okay. Thank you. Imagine a place where state institutions are everywhere. Every university is a state institution. Every NGO must operate under party supervision. Every private company, including foreign-owned ones, must ultimately answer to party authority. This is how 1.4 billion people live. If you want to find truly independent organizations, you would have to go off the grid. I would know because I tried. For 15 years, I reported on China as a journalist. I've been to underground churches, migrant worker villages, interviewed human rights lawyers, LGBTQ activists, feminist groups. Most of those spaces are now closed. We are meeting in Oslo today, the city that gives out the Nobel Peace Prize. Liu Xiaobo was the last Chinese citizen to win it. He was inspired by Western philosophy. He went on overseas academic exchanges here in the University of Oslo, University of Hawaii, and Columbia University. The ideas and connections, the very ones my opponent wants to cut off, shaped his manifesto for democratic reform. He was jailed for it. When he was dying of cancer in state custody, I tried to reach him, to tell his story. I walked right up to the hospital ward. It was guarded by police. The doors were bolted shut. When he died, Chinese people found ways to mourn him, things like candlelight emojis. And those small gestures made it into the global press. They were not isolated, they were connected. In practice, cutting ties with Chinese state institutions means cutting ties with China's people. This is not a principled position. It is a hawkish fantasy with enormous human consequences. Let's look at an assumption underlying this debate today. The idea that isolation somehow produces political change in another society. Is there precedent in modern history? Iran, Cuba, North Korea, decades of isolation and sanctions, and yet none are freer. Let's look at China's own recent history. During its most isolated period, the Cultural Revolution unleashed chaos that killed millions of people. Isolation does not protect people. It means there are fewer witnesses. It hardens systems, increases fear and paranoia, and cuts off the channels where human connection and ideas naturally flow. Isaac and I share a similar path. We both recently left journalism to start China-related consultancies, but we've arrived at different conclusions. My work helps organizations navigate Asia as it is, not through a zero-sum lens. Half of our researchers are based in Asia. And while I was living in Beijing, I started and co-founded a global nonprofit, New Voices, that celebrates women China experts. We now have chapters all around the world. The goal was never to change China from the outside. It was to keep human dialogue and connection alive, to support people. When channels close, that's when propaganda and misinformation can fill the vacuum. When human contact disappears, dehumanization can follow. And dehumanization is what makes war possible. Supporting Isaac's side doesn't just fail to produce positive change, it raises the risk of war. This city gave Liu Xiaobo the Nobel Peace Prize. He couldn't come to collect it. An empty chair sat in his place. Engagement is not perfect. It should have guardrails, but it does not mean endorsement. Because I know a world without connections is not a safer place. It is a more ignorant one, a more dangerous one, full of empty chairs. Choose engagement.
Thank you, Joanna. Now, Isaac, it is your turn to speak. And once again, to remind people listening, you are arguing it is not ethical to cooperate with Chinese state institutions to secure incremental change. The floor is yours. And Isaac, I'm standing right behind you. So, there's your spot over there. You wouldn't want me lurking over your shoulder through the whole. We've seen that act before.
China's on the engagement side, so. There's a story from 1960 in China, the height of Mao's Great Famine, of a young Chinese man, a young government official, who goes back to his family's village. And as he's entering the village, a kind old cadre says, "Son, don't come in here. There's no food left. Both your parents have starved to death." And this young official writes a letter to the central government praising the policies of Mao, because how much suffering can one man take? I bring this story up for two reasons. One is one of the many reasons it's unethical to collaborate, cooperate, engage with Chinese state institutions is the past of the Chinese Communist Party, but also how important it is for us to empathize with those who have to engage with the Chinese Communist Party, Chinese citizens. It's not to say that the choices are ethical, but the choices are incredibly difficult and the choices are required. And if I were in that young man's position, I would have done the same or worse. The conversation we're having here is not about the practicality of engagement or the necessity of engagement. It's about the ethics of engagement. And that makes it a much easier thing to debate very, very clearly on how unethical it is to be engaging with various arms of the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese Communist Party as a whole. History, the present, and also, frankly, most of the time it just doesn't work. And so not only by engaging are you acting unethically, you're acting against your purposes. So, history. The Chinese Communist Party today, two outsiders like to downplay its links to the past. On every Chinese bill, from 1 to 100, is Mao Zedong's face. He is still the center of the party. His face still hangs on top of Tiananmen Square. And Mao is one of the great dictators, great butchers of the 20th century. And it's the same party channeling the same image. Cultural Revolution, Great Leap Forward, tens of millions of people died in China. And they weren't from the Cultural Revolution, as my opponent tried to say. The Cultural Revolution didn't come because China was isolated, it came because of the Chinese Communist Party. We have to put the blame where the blame belongs. The present, China today economically is much more successful. People don't starve to death, with the exception of in Shanghai during the lockdowns, when people were shut in their home and some ran out of food. But it is a country that those in this audience know is still incredibly repressive, incredibly abusive to its own people in ways that take a lot longer than 4.5 minutes to go into. The situation in Xinjiang, where upwards of 1 million Muslims have been placed in concentration camps, in which a recent FT story found has the highest prison capacity of anywhere in the world. Situation in Tibet, the situation with privacy across China is still quite atrocious. On the practicality of it, people will often say, well, we have to work with China to fight climate change. China's coal consumption has gone up. China's carbon emissions actually have gone up about 14% over the last 5-6 years. And when there was a lot of pushback on that, Beijing decided to measure carbon a different way. And so they said, oh, it'll only end up 7%. There's dozens of examples, hundreds of examples of entities engaging with the Chinese Communist Party only to find their interests thwarted. The party is brilliant at using its opponents against each other. I think we're going to go into that in a little bit more detail. But the United Front Work Department, which is the entity in the Communist Party that manages and oversees a lot of the engagement, absolutely brilliant at strengthening the party's friends and weakening the party's enemies. And those are the entities that we're pushing back against here. A final point. Universities, nonprofits, as Joanna was saying, the party is so central to China today that when you are engaging with Tsinghua University, you're engaging with the same entity that runs the camps in Xinjiang. It's all part of the Communist Party. That's why it's unethical to engage with them. Thank you.
Thank you. So now we move on to our second round, and it'll be our longest round in this part of the program. The debaters stay seated, I stay seated. We have more of a free-flowing conversation. I'll be asking questions of my own based on what I heard in the opening statements. They can also question each other. They can even interrupt each other if done in good faith. And later I'm going to be bringing in some questions that were worked out in partnership with the Human Rights Foundation's China team, which are very, very helpful to this conversation. But to tell you what I think I heard in the opening statement on the question of whether it's ethical to cooperate with Chinese state institutions to secure incremental change, and we're defining these institutions very broadly. Joanna Chu is arguing, yes, it is ethical, because to do otherwise essentially is to abandon the Chinese people to a human rights fate that nobody would want. She points out that isolation and ostracization has not worked in cases like Cuba and Iran. She says the idea of cutting people off entirely is a hawkish fantasy. It's dangerous, it's empty, it raises the risk of war, and it doesn't really lead to any good. I hear you, Isaac, taking the opposite side from 2 points of view. On the one hand, you're saying that while in some ways there might be something of a practical case to be made for engagement with China, but which I'll get to, there's just an unethical case. You shouldn't be dealing with entities that you characterize it the way that you characterize them. That they just they don't deserve it. That it's immoral to even engage with them. But you also argue that it doesn't work. That ultimately. Change in China is more likely to come about from ostracization, that's the kind of punishment that would, implied punishment that would potentially cause the Chinese to change, Chinese Communist Party to change. I'm interested in this point that you're making that there's a separation between practical and ethical, and I want to ask you, do you buy that distinction? Or do you think there's a difference between what's ethical and what's practical? Or
I agree we shouldn't spend time debating the practicalities of engagement and where to engage or not, but the ethical is whether it is ethical for incremental change in China. And no human rights organizations or activists in China says that they don't want the world engaged in China, that they don't want researchers and international journalists on the ground to tell what is happening. And journalists, Radio Free Asia, US government-funded journalists, were the first to report on the internment camps in Xinjiang. So the world that Isaac is advocating for is one that I have not heard Chinese activists or civil society ask for.
And it's unethical in what sense?
It's unethical because it equates the Chinese people with the Chinese state. And we know that China is not a democracy. Its leaders are not elected. And it is unethical to give up on 1.4 billion Chinese people.
I would say that my esteemed opponent is conflating China and the Chinese Communist Party. And we are defining Chinese state institutions very broadly. But the way to engage with Chinese people is not, as the party says, people-to-people diplomacy, which is code word for United Front Action, but finding ways to engage with individual Chinese outside of a state setting. It's very challenging. Don't get me wrong, but we're talking here about what are the ethical imperatives with this. The second thing...
Oh, can you give a bit more detail? How would you, if your goal was to secure change in China, how would you find these individuals outside of state institutions?
I mean, I think we know plenty of those individuals, and we know ways of engaging with them outside, and we have these conversations outside of China. You can't have the change-making conversations inside China, and the organizations that you discuss that are active in China today make horrific ethical compromises to stay there. So there's a major US nonprofit institution which, in order to stay in China, shares its global grant-making details with the Ministry of State Security. And they make the same argument that my opponent does. They say, well, we have to be in China because we cannot abandon 1.4 billion people. Well, 1.4 billion people, unfortunately, are better served by human rights associations outside of China than within.
I want to bring in the example of education. So the trend in the United States and also in Europe, where for 30 to 40 years there was an increasing number of students from China coming to study in the West, has reversed dramatically in the last 2 years. And I'd like to ask each of you to analyze what that means, because on the one hand, I know the US government is portraying these students as a security risk, as accusing them of transfer of technology through knowledge, espionage, et cetera. On the other hand, the argument could be made that those individuals go back to China with a sense of possibility from having exposure to a society with greater civil liberties. Sort of, which is it? And again, from the practical and ethical point of view, I'll take that to you first, Joanna.
I think when particularly Americans talk about change, like making change around the world, often it's implying that they're most interested in political change. But we're talking about progress and change in China, and that is in areas that dialogue is actually more possible. Places like health, children's health, maternal health. So the Ministry of Education in China has been working with UNICEF for decades, and this has greatly improved children's rural education, disabled children's access to education. There are many concrete benchmarks of where these areas of cooperation have improved lives for normal people in China. So I hope today that we have a broader view. Our goal is not to create regime change in China. I think that's a bit of a Western or colonial thinking. We're talking about what is good for the Chinese people. And that includes things like climate, health, AI, that governments are cooperating, as President Xi and Trump talked about in the last summit last month in Beijing, that there should be cooperation on guardrails for AI.
So the point that Joanna was just making about the impact on children and education, that does sound like an ethical good, that good things are happening to the Chinese people as a result of the kind of transfer she's talking about.
So the reason why entities have engaged, so actually, I'll respond to this in two ways. One is it ethical in 1980s or 1990s to support the Ministry of Health as it acts in China? Different calculus than it is today, where China is a wealthy and powerful country. Two is the sacrifices that entities had to make in order to secure that cooperation with the Ministry of Health were pretty extreme. And I think there's broadly speaking two ethical schools. There's utilitarian, greatest amount of good for greatest amount of people, but also I'm going to behave unethically in order so I may meet ethical means. And then there's the Kantian school, the categorical imperative. Act as if your actions become a moral imperative. And certainly what my colleague is suggesting, I don't think falls in either of those schools, frankly. Second, on the question of regime change being an imperialist fantasy, I believe, and I think Joanna agrees with me, that the Chinese people should be able to decide who their leader is. And they cannot do that under the Chinese Communist Party today.
So Isaac, could you answer the question I posed to you? Can you show the chain of causality? The Western world, say, all decide to isolate China, including commercial, including the UN groups, UNICEF, including the WHO. How does that lead step by step to any of what we discussed today? Improvements in health, civil rights, or even political change where there might be more accountability or transparency?
And as a prelude to answering that question, I'm curious to know where do you draw the line? Like how much cutting off do you want to do? If an American jazz orchestra goes to China or the Berlin Philharmonic, is that okay with you, or is that something that should not be happening?
So, if this were a debate about is it practical to cooperate with Chinese state institutions, my answers would be different. We're talking about the ethics of working directly with organizations that are complicit with genocide. To play this out, so if every organization in the world decided to stop working with the Chinese Communist Party, and that included every Chinese organization, the party would either have to crack down greatly or evolve. One of those two things would be required. It's hard to imagine a scenario where everyone in China just stopped working with the Communist Party. But that kind of collective action, if everyone did that, would have to lead to dramatic change. And maybe the party would then seize control even deeper, or maybe they would liberalize. It's impossible to say. However, the ethics of this are not on those who collaborate nearly as much as they are on the Chinese Communist Party itself. And that's the entity that we're seeking to change.
And last year at an open debate forum, you said that Xi Jinping has shown that he's willing to put a lot of pain on his people. And you just said today that one of the avenues for change is if the world cut off China, and this led to so much pain and suffering and frustration from the Chinese people that they basically rise up and there's a revolution. And are you saying that the West will knowingly cause this and likely a violent clash between the people and the Chinese Communist Party? Is that the best way to secure change?
As I said clearly a minute ago, there's two different options. I mean, we don't know which one the party would choose in this imaginary scenario of everyone in the world doing a particular thing. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how you parse out the Ministry of Health that works in Eastern China with the Ministry of Health that's complicit in Xinjiang.
So my side does not have to argue that engagement is always successful or that it always works or it should work in every single sector. As a Canadian, we actually don't have these conversations very often on whether Canadians should cut off China because, first of all, Beijing would laugh, like we don't care if Canadians stop talking to us. This is a position that the US, as one of the two superpowers, has the privilege to entertain. And even in the US, there's no acceptance for this very blanket ban approach. Even at the most hawkish, the US administration is not advocating for cutting off China entirely. There's the idea of a small yard and a high fence where when you're dealing with a state that is hostile or adversary, you close off certain areas that are more vulnerable, that have more national security concerns, like military, satellite technology cooperation. But that keeps it possible to continue engagement in areas like trade of consumer goods, in health, in child health, in disease prevention. So I don't see any example where any government or any legitimate institution is asking for what you're saying is a reasonable approach.
You keep talking about China as opposed to the Chinese Communist Party. China is not as repressive as North Korea is. There is still daylight between the party and the people. Yeah. And there's still a lot of opportunity for people, for the Chinese in this audience who are a lot more hawkish on the Chinese Communist Party. The other thing is, I think you're downplaying the importance of Canada in the world and also the ability that every individual and every institution has globally to decide if they want to engage with the Chinese Communist Party or not. It's a really important debate that needs to be happening across institutions, across universities, where they decide, okay, well, there's a lot of brilliant and wonderful Chinese students. Is it ethical for my university to engage with Tsinghua University or Fudan? and work directly with the Communist Party to get these students, or do I have to make the ethical decision of cutting them off? And far be it for me to be the architect of the world and tell institutions how to act. What I would strongly encourage is for people to have that debate inside institutions around the world.
And I think Canadians can be a bit, self-deprecating, but I think our Prime Minister has gotten a lot of respect for his speech in Davos, where he said that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And middle powers have a role to play. All democracies have a role to play, and being at the table means you could be part of the framing of these conversations in regulations. If you withdraw completely, you don't have a voice at the table.
I want to shift the geographic framework a little bit away from North America for a moment. I'll take this question to you, Isaac. The Belt and Road Initiative is China's program of investment in the global south. Serious investment in infrastructure, serious investment in agriculture, improvement of food supply, fighting hunger in nations that really need this sort of help. Now, if this is engagement with Chinese state institutions on the part of these nations in South America and in Africa, do they have a different ethical framework or from the one you're describing, or do they have exactly the same ethical decision to make to engage or not to engage?
So again, I want to make the very broad point that it's not for me to tell people in Zimbabwe or Bolivia how they make decisions and how they engage. I will say, however, though, oftentimes this debate, you have people who are very, very critical of global imperialism and colonialism, but then see China doing radically similar things and pretend that it's okay. I remember interviewing the Rwandan ambassador to Beijing and said that if China colonizes us, we deserve it. And I think that's very silly. I think there's this sense that because China is using different terms for what it's doing, it's not colonialism, it's not imperialism. Secondly, it's very case by case on whether or not added investment from outside entities into countries like Malawi or the Solomon Islands or you name it, leads actually to better economic outcomes. And then the final one is that Beijing doesn't invest in isolation. What it brings economically, it brings doubly politically. And there's so many examples of that.
But if, as you're saying that you think Canada and the United States should treat China like a pariah, should these nations also be treating China like a pariah? Do they have the same ethical decision to make?
Oh, I'm not saying these countries, so my argument is very easy to straw man. And the idea of treating China like a pariah is very different from working very differently with the Chinese Communist Party.
Okay, clarify that.
So the sense is the question is ethical to cooperate with Chinese state institutions? The answer is no. The question is, when you're running a government, do you always have to behave ethically? The answer to that is also no. We make sacrifices as part of our daily life.
Yeah, and
This book was made in China, suit was made in China. We make those sacrifices. It's not, this is an absolute position, it's what is ethical. And it behooves us to understand that we also behave unethically.
Mm-hmm. And Isaac, could you clarify, do you think foreign journalists should work with the Chinese state to secure visas to report on the ground in China?
I think foreign journalists should understand that they are making an ethical sacrifice in order to do what they feel like is important to do.
You think it's an ethical sacrifice to go report on China?
I think it's I think the decision to work with a Chinese state entity, so I don't go back to China anymore, which is sad. I miss the place. But the point is not, oh, I have to just talk to these visa people. The point is, and we've had these debates, and journalists have these debates all the time, it's, I'm not going to do a certain type of reporting for 6 months before I go to China. Because if I don't do that type of reporting, I'm more likely to get a visa. It's a common unspoken secret on how journalists work. They want to get in, and so they pull their punches before they go. Is it for the greater good? Yes. Is that decision ethical? No.
So you're saying that it's for the greater good that we have foreign journalists based in China?
Oh, I think there's a lot more than that of why foreign journalists should be based in China. And the culprit here is not the journalists themselves. They're much, much smaller of a piece of this than what the Chinese Communist Party does to require them to do that.
And I assume you also agree that there should be academic access on the ground in China so they can do independent as research.
What is independent research in China today?
That we're not getting all the information on China from Chinese state institutions or Chinese state media, that we have, whether it's through NGOs, civil society, journalists, that we have some multi-layered view into what's happening in the country.
There's a Mao expression, clear water has no fish. People make sacrifices. I make sacrifices to do certain things. But I think it's very dangerous for us to assume that the academics who don't meet with the Uyghur students in the months before coming to China are behaving ethically by not meeting with Uyghur students.
So I think Isaac and I are very in similar circles. As an editor at Foreign Policy magazine, he actually gave me my first byline. So maybe just to give a bit of context. So foreign journalists, their numbers are dwindling in China. And a lot of that is because most of them have not self-censored. I know because I've worked for multiple European, American newsrooms, and there's these conversations that if we give some, then you keep retreating. So I know the Foreign Correspondents Club in China, continues to put up press freedom reports. And I know, just recently, as a few days ago, the New York Times had its correspondent expelled from China. And there's only one New York Times journalist left in China. If all of these foreign newsrooms were self-censoring, there would be more of them in China. There's so few now because a lot of newsrooms continue to cover a wide range of issues on China, and we're among the only ones to cover human rights issues. There's no freedom of the press in China. There's no independent newsrooms in China. The only information we have from China on human rights is from the outside world and the exchanges and the people on the ground that we have today. So I think I'm failing to see in your world, in your parallel universe, that there is positive change in China, that we have views of what's happening in the country.
I was just going to say I was grateful for the argument you just made, because I think it's an excellent point about, on the one hand, journalists are behaving ethically by not doing the sacrifices they need to get into China today. On the other hand, there's a loss because of that. We have less information than we would otherwise. And one could think, too, about individuals high up in the Chinese Communist Party who are either secret reformers or who are leaking information or who are maybe actively planning to overthrow Xi Jinping. Who knows? The top of the party is opaque. We don't understand what's going on. But those people's lives are riven from an ethical standpoint. On the one hand, they're engaging with the party and they're acting as part of the party. On the other hand, they're trying to bring change within the party.
Yeah, there are still whistleblowers within the Chinese government. The NGOs, journalists, they still have sources. It's harder.
To bring it back to the ethical terminology, do you agree with this notion that a journalist going to China is making an ethical sacrifice?
No. Often they're sacrificing, time with their families. So many correspondents, they're living in China, but their families are outside. They're taking great personal risk. Like, I've been harassed and assaulted by Chinese police, and it's just gotten worse. So, yeah, we shouldn't be, I think it's not to demonize journalists who are doing the work on the ground here. I would also like to point out that all international studies point to daylight on what's happening in China as helpful to the most vulnerable. So a 2021 study analyzing court cases found that when there was more international attention, there was a 70% higher chance of political prisoners being released before sentencing. So I know that diplomats and journalists always try to get into the courtrooms, and Chinese police always try to get them out. If this attention was irrelevant, why would the Chinese state work so hard to keep the outside world away? And if we do what the CCP wants, which is withdraw and don't have exchanges and NGO activity and media coverage, that is giving the CCP what it wants. So Isaac, why do you think this is something that would help?
Oh, it's not what the CCP wants at all. CCP wants engagement on its terms. It wants the world to engage with the Beijing that it seeks to make us think exists, as opposed to the China that actually exists. It doesn't want people to go live in China, foreigners. It wants foreigners to visit China. You used to love to say Kissinger visited China 80 times, so he knows more about China than anyone else. Well, there are people who actually can go live in China, but Beijing doesn't like that.
But doesn't that mean that your advocacy of disengagement would give the Chinese Communist Party exactly what it wants?
The Communist Party as I just said, doesn't want disengagement. It wants engagement on its terms. It would love for Joanne and I to go back to China. It would love that. It would love us to go, write self-criticisms, explain the error of our ways, apologize for even implying that China would be better off without the Communist Party run it, apologize for all the lies, the malicious slander we're spreading about Xinjiang and Tibet, and talk about how wonderful it would be for the world for China to be the preeminent superpower. That's what Beijing wants. That's a lot of engagement.
I want to move on to, as I mentioned at the beginning, we've partnered this time with the Human Rights Foundation's China team to develop some further questions that, in their view, are going to challenge our debaters. And so I'm going to go to the first question. This one will be for you, Joanna. The CCP has an extraordinary ability to co-opt narratives to improve their own reputation while hiding their own transgressions. The Chinese government, for example, has been accused of greenwashing itself as a global leader on sustainability and green energy, and claims to be putting in an unprecedented amount of investment in sustainable development, all while displacing Tibetan villages and causing environmental damage. Even if the Chinese government were to promise that they would address issues of human rights abuses in order to do business with democracies, how can we ensure trust that they will be transparent and consistent in these dealings?
We should not expect assurances. We should not treat the Chinese Communist Party with anything but very serious suspicion. And I think Isaac and I, again, very similar paths. After leaving China, we kept writing about China, and we were both, if I can, characterize your book, like, frustrated and upset by Western elites for being so naive about China and the Communist Party, and to seek capitalist gain at all costs. And my book and his book seeks to demystify the United Front, how China wields influence. And we mentioned in Belt and Road, a lot of what I try to help educate people about is that it's not just through sticks, it's also through carrots. Like, here's $5 million, $1 billion to build a road. But that's a case for engagement. We wouldn't have the insights both of us have on the United Front if we didn't have our experience of living in China and opportunities to learn Mandarin. So we should not trust any assurances from any government. It's about being careful and having knowledge and informed engagement. And we get that from experts. And we have China experts, not from people in DC who've never stepped foot in China, but from keeping those channels for students to have exchanges, to learn Chinese. We need that in order to be smarter when engaging with Beijing in any way.
You can comment on the response, or you can take your question.
I'll take my question.
Okay. For Isaac, the clothes on your back, the phone in your pocket, the microphone you're wearing and using, all likely include elements made wholly or in part in the PRC. Is it realistic and pragmatic to entirely steer clear of truly doing business with any and all Chinese state institutions?
Absolutely not. And I was so thrilled that the debate topic, which I keep pointing to, is about ethics as opposed to pragmatism or reality. There's a lot that we do on a day-to-day basis that requires sacrifices. And this is something we learn when we're, 2 or 3? I mean, this is a very basic idea. We don't live in some sort of ethical paradise that doesn't require us to make difficult decisions. And I think there's something to be said about living absolutely and living one's values. But show of hands in the audience, who has no China-made goods?
You might, for the record, tell us what you're seeing.
Yes, for people who are watching at home, not a single hand was raised.
Would you care to comment?
I see Isaac as arguing from my side.
It's good, I see you arguing from my side.
Oh, okay.
How so?
Because he's saying that, people make compromises sometimes, and there's basically no ability to cut off from Chinese state institutions, and there shouldn't be.
So the question of should one take the ethical stance. So my company, we don't engage with the Chinese Communist Party. We engage with Chinese people. We engage with entities that engage with the Chinese Communist Party. But we made the decision early on that it is not safe, practical, or ethical to be working with the Chinese Communist Party. Mm-hmm. So there's certainly a lot more that most entities could do that would be, I think, both beneficial for China as a whole and Chinese people, and would probably be beneficial for them.
Yeah.
But again, I'm trying not to preach or harp on certain of these points, and I don't want to be the ethical arbiter for entities around the world. That said, is it ethical? It's not.
Mm-hmm.
Who are you? And I'm not saying this facetiously. When you say you don't want to be the ethical arbiter for entities around the world, whose position are you representing when you speak about the ethical position?
Oh, I'm representing my own position.
Just yourself?
Well, I think the U.S. entities, U.S. institutions, U.S. universities, those entities specifically, and U.S.-China watchers, happy to. I think it's, as we're talking about the world, I'm happy to say, oh, here's what I think Botswana should do, but I want to be careful about stepping into shoes that I don't fully understand.
And your company helps foreign companies engage with Chinese businesses. Do you ever advise them to shut down their China-based businesses entirely?
So we help companies understand and reduce their China risk, and in certain cases, we feel like the risks are worth it. And so, That's
a practical, not an ethical case you're making to those companies?
We would love to be making ethical cases to companies. I think as you'll find, they very rarely want to hear those arguments. They want to hear about public affairs. They want to hear about the financial impact of what they're doing. They don't want to hear, this is what Immanuel Kant said, and this is what John Stuart Mill said, and here's a way to try to parse those things.
Joanne, a question for you. Looking at the current state of business, U.S. firms have not been successful at compelling Chinese businesses to adhere to universal principles such as human rights or the rule of law in exchange for participation in the global economy. On the other hand, Chinese firms have been quite successful at engaging U.S. firms in cutting deals that prop up and abet Chinese transgressions, whether that be multinational companies such as the Hilton Hotels from expanding into the Uyghur region next to re-education camps, or buying cotton and goods made from forced labor. If U.S. firms were to attempt to engage China in limited and strategic ways while addressing human rights, for instance, which you argue is possible, what are the incentives powerful enough or accountability mechanisms strong enough to allow for ethical cooperations between democratic states and China? And if they exist, why haven't we used them yet?
Yeah, so my main argument or argument at all is not that private companies in the West are the ones that are most likely to create incremental change in China. I'm mostly looking at track 2 diplomacy, journalists, researchers, NGO workers, UN, UNICEF, World Bank. These are the ones with track records of producing actual concrete changes in Chinese society, and businesses, like Isaac said, will always be looking at their bottom line, at their shareholders. So no, I don't think businesses are the best way to create change. But when governments put regulations in place, like the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act, which came as a result of investigators and NGOs and journalists on the ground that gave information on how Uyghur forced labor are part of supply chains, part of cotton making. Part of my firm's work is actually helping these companies do their due diligence to figure out if any part of their supply chain is compromised. And companies do care about that because there's actual consequences in, global regulations that if their supply chains are found to have forced labor in them, that there are real fines and consequences. So I think we shouldn't think of companies as Trojan horses. We should support track 2 diplomacy, but also when there are real consequences to doing business with certain aspects of forced labor, child labor in China, I do see actual, investment in trying to avoid that.
So on the Uyghur Forced Labor Act, that doesn't seem like an example of engagement. That, if anything, seems like an example of it's an isolating.
No, the Uyghur Forced Labor Act is not telling companies not to trade with China. It's telling companies to do so with accountability and transparency and to show their supply chains. So I think this is a very positive example of engagement that's informed by deep research on the ground that only international researchers and journalists were able to provide.
I would say the UFLPA, Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, is definitely a tool for decoupling. And the U.S. Congress didn't say it that way all that explicitly. But the idea is it creates a rebuttable presumption that requires anyone importing from Xinjiang to prove that there's no forced labor in the supply chain, which is almost impossible because of the opacity in Xinjiang. And so it raises the cost for US companies to engage with China. And I think for that reason, it was quite an ethical act and something rare to see from a government body on that.
Mm-hmm. I just had a conversation with a human rights worker who comes from Taiwanese ancestry just before the talk today. And she said that for their latest report on forced labor, they actually got responses from some Chinese companies on their supply chains. And she doesn't know exactly why, but she credits things like actual regulations that makes companies based in China feel more like that they have to provide answers to a Chinese human rights NGO that's based in New York.
The last question is for you, Isaac, and this, I think we touched on this a little bit, but we can go over it in more depth. The Belt and Road Initiative is increasing connectivity and building infrastructural projects that are providing communities with educational and economic opportunities in healthcare. What do you say to those people who are directly benefiting from the BRI, who simply want to put food on the table? Why should they care about the complicity and rights abuses of Chinese state institutions when they are simply trying to survive day by day?
I don't know about this sort of imagined subaltern who is just trying to survive day by day and then receives fish or a healthcare subsidy from a Chinese entity and then goes on TV and praises the Chinese Communist Party. I think a lot of that comes from the party's own media on this engagement. The second thing is, and again, I'm trying to be careful not to get in the shoes of someone who goes and has to decide between a Huawei cell phone or no cell phone. And in that case, it's a very difficult decision to make. But, again, as human beings, we often behave unethically in order to do what we feel like is best for ourselves and our family.
How do you, in all of your arguments, how do you separate the ethical framework from the impact of the behavior?
I don't think that this sort of, nameless Zimbabwean farmer buying a Huawei cell phone actually brings incremental positive change to China. I think it makes Huawei slightly wealthier. I think it makes the Chinese Communist Party slightly more entrenched globally. And I don't think his actions are beneficial. Again, I don't think I have the right to judge him for that decision, but I don't think that's what's going to bring change to China.
You care to comment on the question?
No.
Okay, so now we're going to move on to what we call a lightning round. We have 5 questions that we're looking for very short answers, almost yes or no, plus a little bit more. Question number 1, and I should have brought out a coin to toss, but I won't. I'll go to you, Joanna. Question number 1, would a change of leadership in China change your answer to the question we're debating?
No, engagement creates channels and visibility regardless of who's in charge.
If the Communist Party falls, coin flip on if it's better or worse.
Okay. Question number 2. If China moves militarily on Taiwan, should all cooperation end immediately? Joanna?
Some, but not all. In a conflict, that's why you need channels with diplomacy and information more.
So I would like to dig in a little bit when you say some and not all. How do you categorize the division?
During a conflict, you may want to cut some economic, especially military cooperation. If there's any military research going on, probably cut that. But having people on the ground, having communication channels, and diplomats being able to do the work, that's what you need more during a conflict.
Okay. Isaac, I think this question is really easy for you, this one. If China moves militarily on Taiwan, should we cut all cooperation immediately?
Partial invasion, no. Full-scale invasion, basically all.
Okay. Let's talk about what happened with TikTok. The U.S. government claiming that the company ByteDance constituted a security threat through its social media app TikTok was forced by the U.S. to sell its operations to U.S. owners and come under their control. In light of the sides that you're each arguing, does this, to you, constitute a reasonable move, Joanna?
Yes, because it was a result of open dialogue between U.S. officials and ByteDance, and there was a court process.
So you feel it represents a kind of engagement?
It represents engagement. I wouldn't say it was done right the whole time, but the final result was something that ByteDance agreed to.
So ByteDance is a problem for 2 reasons. 1 is still extant links with the Chinese Communist Party. 2 is the brain rot of tens of millions of Americans being addicted for another reason to their phone. So no, I don't think it's ethical.
Our fourth question. Joanna, can you name one instance of where cooperation with a Chinese institution in retrospect was clearly a mistake?
Yes, when universities around the world accepted Confucius institutes on campuses without guardrails or oversight.
Why?
Because a lot of the Chinese language material pushed pro-CCP agendas, and there was censorship pressures within global campuses. So yeah, that's an example of engagement that's not clear-eyed, that doesn't have guardrails. And I've been calling for informed engagement with information and guardrails.
During the course of this debate, you mean, yes.
Same answer, except they did have guardrails and it still didn't work.
Finally, our question asks about incremental change. Is any incremental change happening? Can you name a concrete example from the last 5 years?
I think the most powerful example of how important it is Xinjiang, because it was only international researchers and journalists who got the information out, and Beijing went from denying the camps existed to partially dismantling them.
China is so large and complex, it's hundreds of thousands of steps backwards, slightly fewer than hundreds of thousands of steps forwards. So there are so many incremental changes happening all the time, but I do not think it's going in the right direction.
Okay. Thank you for finishing the lightning round. And we're coming down to the home stretch of this debate, and that's where each of the debaters will be making a closing statement one more time to try to persuade you to their side of the argument. And again, we're going to poll you afterwards with the QR code that'll be put up on the screen. And so we're going to go in the same speaking order for our closing round. Joanna, you have 2 minutes and the floor is yours.
We have been discussing whether engagement with China can produce incremental progress, or whether isolation can somehow produce political change. A vote for my side is a vote for keeping channels open in business, climate, health, education, and the kinds of exchange that have no strategic purpose at all: friendships, relationships, ordinary human connection. A vote for Isaac's side is a vote for a worldview that essentially equates the Chinese people with the Chinese state and ultimately gives up on them. We don't have to imagine where that leads. We saw this when the US and China were in a race to the bottom, cutting visa exchanges, closing down consulates. And the people who paid the price are not senior officials in Washington or Beijing. They were ordinary people, researchers, journalists, and families cut off from each other. This is where so-called principle distant leads. Fewer channels for understanding, more suspicion, more nationalism, and greater risk of war. There is no perfect solution here. The resolution asks whether engagement can create incremental progress, not whether it always succeeds. And I cannot imagine a safer world built around 1.4 billion people living in isolation from the rest of humanity. I am one of hundreds of millions of people of Chinese ancestry who holds liberal values, not because a government handed them to us, but because people are more complex than political systems. A vote for me stands for the belief that people can change when they remain in contact with each other. The idea that isolation produces progress, history suggests otherwise. If you're confident in the value of open societies, you should believe those values are stronger through contact and exchange, not fear. The alternative to engagement is not freedom, it is ignorance. Vote for the side that still believes in human possibility.
And Isaac, you get the last word.
A Chinese artist that I knew who collaborated with the state, who, when Ai Weiwei was imprisoned, would draw on her hand a watch. And each day she would erase it and draw it anew, symbolizing the number of days that he was in prison. And this was a very, very small ethical act of resistance amid a career that she had to spend navigating a deeply unethical entity. I think we're having a different debate. The debate is not, is it practical to engage with the Chinese Communist Party? Is it necessary to engage with the Chinese Communist Party? The debate is it ethical to do so? And that's what we have to focus on. That's what you have to remember as you go home and think about this, and you think about your own behavior vis-a-vis Chinese universities. The point is not to isolate Chinese people. The point is not to demonize Chinese people. The point is to realize the amount of control the Chinese Communist Party has over China today and figure out other ways, thoughtful ways, subversive ways of engaging with Chinese people outside of China. Again, people-to-people diplomacy sounds like such a good thing until you realize that people-to-people is a united front term. Working with Chinese universities to bring Chinese students here has a lot of benefits, and you have to understand that Beijing uses Chinese students as pawns, not willingly, unwillingly. We have to understand the way that the system operates in China today to understand the sacrifices that we make to engage. And the great paradox about this conversation is, both Joanna and I, in order to have the insights we had about China, have made, and you don't mind if I speak for you here, but made ethical sacrifices to be there. My first entry into China was a scholarship that I got via the Chinese Communist Party, my first studying there. So I've made those sacrifices. Far be it from me to tell people not to make the same ethical sacrifices that I made, but it's so crucially important to understand that's not ethical behavior. Thank you.
So in a moment, I'll ask you to take the poll again. I just want to request that if you didn't take the poll the first time, please don't take it the second time. Before we do that, I just want to say a couple of things. One thing, I want to thank, once again, the Human Rights Foundation for having us here. I also want to thank our CEO, Leah Mathau, our executive producer, Alexis Pangrazi, and also a board member of our organization helped forge this partnership last year, and that's Clay O'Connor, who's in the audience somewhere. So to all of you, I just want to thank you and give you a round of applause for what you've done. But mostly, I want to thank our debaters. We try to make the point that you just saw is something that can happen, that people can disagree in principle with deep convictions, but do so in a way that's respectful, and that sheds light, and that makes all of us think, makes all of us understand what the trade-offs are. And the two of you did this so excellently. I just want to thank you so much for that. That deserves one more round of applause. As you go to vote on the QR code, I'm just curious. We're going to publish the results tomorrow morning. It'll show up on the app. And I'm just curious, again, by round of applause, I'm going to ask, did anybody change their mind from any position to any other position, from yes to no, no to yes, undecided to yes, undecided to no, just by a round of applause? Did anybody move during the course of the debate? Wow. All right. I mean, to us, that proves that people were really listening and meeting our goal of being open to debate. So thank you very much for that. Please vote, and I want to ask our debaters to step forward and shake hands as we wrap up. Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening.